I'm just not okay right now.
There are a lot of theories as to why we're seeing such a huge increase of anxiety in millennials and Gen Z. Social media, too much academic pressure to succeed, cyberbullying, climate change. But one thing we're not talking about enough, our biology. The state of mental health in young people is deteriorating.
You feel like you're underwater, that someone is pushing you underwater and you cannot get up.
Even before the pandemic wrecked all of us, feelings of hopelessness or sadness increased by 40% in high schoolers. Those seriously considering attempting suicide increased by 36%. It's hard to prove why we're seeing these worrying trends, but a huge contributing factor might be baked into our biology. See, the way our brains and bodies evolved over millions of years simply doesn't match the world in which we find ourselves today. From primates to early hominids like Neanderthals to our modern Homo sapiens, evolution takes a really, really long time.
As far as we can tell, our brains are largely the same types of brains that our ancestors had some 200 or 300,000 years ago.
And what that meant was that our brains and central nervous systems evolved to suit that specific environment. Humans were just little tribes of hunter-gatherers from 300,000 years ago until about 12,000 years ago when we discovered farming. Only then did we become slightly larger and larger tribes until we built cities and societies. But think about that. For something like 96% of human history, life was exactly the same from generation to generation. Here's a great way to think about this that kind of blew my mind. If you divide the last 300,000 years of human history into a 1,200-page book, with each page being 250 years, on the first 1,199 pages, we had fewer than 1 billion people on the planet. On the 1,200th page, we've crossed the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 billion person threshold. For the first 1,199 pages of the book, we walked, ran, or rode horses. On page 1176, we maybe took a sailboat. But on page 1200, we developed the steam locomotive, cars, submarines, airplanes, and space travel. The first handwritten letter happened 10 pages ago. The telegraph, telephone, mobile phone, iPhone, and FaceTime all happened on page 1200. The bottom line is that the speed of innovation has become exponential compared to our evolutionary past. And unfortunately, it takes biology a long time to catch up. And anxiety is a place where we're seeing that mismatch between how we evolved and how we live now.
The way that I describe it is if we were under a imminent threat right now, our body would go into overdrive to keep us safe. Our heart would start pumping, our breathing would change, our muscles would tighten. And what happens with an anxiety trigger is the brain perceives something as being worthy of that response. The same system that would be firing if we were actually in danger fires. So it feels very real. It's just the trigger is not imminently threatening.
There's a scientific term for this, mismatch condition.
We find ourselves living today in an environment that is so different from the environment of our ancestors that we are mismatched for the environment.
Diabetes is a great example of a mismatch condition.
Our ancestors didn't have much access to high carbohydrate foods or high fat foods, and so it was really advantageous whenever you encountered those foods to try to consume as much of them as you could.
But today, almost all mass-produced food is sugary or fatty. Humans developed diabetes because of that mismatch between how our bodies evolved and how we live today. The same may be true for anxiety.
I think we can think about our mental health in a similar way, that we are living in an environment that is so different from the environment of our ancestors. We're basically mismatched.
We absolutely needed our anxiety response, or we all would have been eaten by larger predators we were blissfully unafraid of. But it wasn't just physical threats.
We are adapted to be able to, respond to social cues and communication with a small number of people that are probably relatives or at least distant relatives. And that's not the environment we find ourselves in anymore.
50,000 years ago, when your survival depended on tight bonds with your tribe of 100 humans, being cast out for a social transgression was possibly a death sentence. But our tribes don't work that way anymore.
And so that can lead to anxiety and stress because we're using these minds that adapted to an environment that is so different from the environment that we're in today.
Very few modern humans are in danger of being eaten by a tiger. Being socially ostracized from a small tribe of people rarely results in you dying or being unable to mate and pass on your genes. But we're constantly bombarded by news alerts, surrounded by social media, text messages, advertising, you name it, all capable of generating an anxiety response. So it's not a huge surprise that our lizard brains aren't coping as well as they used to.
The very, very rapid changes that we see playing out today, where, there's new technology from one year to the next, literally, clearly that's not something that we can expect to be able to adapt to through evolutionary processes in any kind of a time span that's going to be relevant to us. It's going to take at least thousands, if not tens of thousands of years for any kind of evolutionary change to that environment is possible. We're now at a point, for really the first time in the history of our species, that we have influence over how we continue to evolve. I mean, we can shape our environments in deliberate ways. That gives us the ability to have some control over our evolution.